Welcome everyone to episode 4 of Down to the Wire Sports Talk Show with Bernal. Today we have another special guest joining me today. He's a Regional Multimedia Sports Editor for the Patriot Ledger, the Brockton Enterprise, and the Wicked Local. Chris McDaniel. How are we doing today, Chris?
Good. How's it going, Desmond? Thanks for
Good.
having me on.
Good, man. Thanks for joining me. I really appreciate it. And first thing I always ask every guest on my show so far is just what your journey's been like navigating through the sports journalism field. Like I said, you're a regional multimedia sports editor. So what's that been like?
Yeah, so I just kind of worked my way up the ladder a little bit. Coming out of college, I got pretty close to graduation, and I was kind of like, well, I don't really have any job prospects lined up, so I just kind of got lucky. I sent an email over to the Patriot Ledger and the Brockton Enterprise, and they were, hiring paid interns. So I ended up with one of those positions, worked there for a couple of years. Then a position opened up at another paper in the company at Wicked Local, which are the weekly papers. So I was able to land a full-time job there, covering Hingham, Marshfield, and Norwell. I eventually tacked on a couple more towns during my time there. And, in 2019, after 5 years with the Wicked Locals, switched over back to the dailies. And, I've been as the sports editor of the Enterprise and Ledger now for almost 2 years.
Nice. That's awesome, man. And I always feel like everyone has a story and like why they kind of want to become a sports reporter. Like for me and my sake, I just always love sports, and I always love shows like Sports Center, how they could just wake up every day and just report on either games that happened the day before or news in certain sports, transactions, trades. Um, and that for me personally, that's kind of where that passion for sports journalism grew. You kind of just after graduation, kind of just send email out to the Enterprise and Ledger. But did you have like an experience, whether in college or in high school, like writing for high school newspaper, that you just knew you wanted to be a sports reporter?
Not quite. I think, like a lot of people in this industry, I, kind of grew up thinking, one day I'd be playing at Fenway Park or something like that. And then, when I topped out at 5'9", and, my athleticism probably topped out about, a D minus, that playing pro sports probably wasn't going to happen for me pretty early on. So, I knew I've wanted to work in sports, as long as I can remember. I've been, reading box scores, like you mentioned, and, following trades and messing around with the ESPN trade machine and all that kind of stuff. So, I just kind of ended up, cycling through some of the potential options, and eventually journalism is kind of where I seem to find a little bit of a niche. Wrote for my local paper with the Quincy Sun, working for Sean Brennan, who, worked for the Boston Herald for a while there. And, that was kind of my first taste of writing and covering local sports. And then, I was really inexperienced when I ended up getting the position at the Patriot Ledger. So I think I just got real lucky with, some opportune timing, and, just kind of ran with it. And, once I started doing it, every day in this job is a little different. Every day is a different story, a different assignment. And, I think that's something that really attracted me to the job, is that, every day is fun. It doesn't feel like work very often.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's like, I guess one thing, I mean, a lot of people want to shoot for is something to do. Their job is something fun and engaging, and it's not the same boring or same routine thing over and over again. So to create different sports stories, like, I don't know, looking at the football team and finding some interesting feature stories, I can definitely relate on how reporting and everything can just kind of create that interest. But like we said before, you kind of the sports editor for the Ledger, the Enterprise. What has your experience been writing for these multiple publications? Has there been a challenge kind of like covering sports, like handling so much sports at once um, on that aspect?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenge because, in a given season, you're covering 4, 5, 6, 7 different sports. And, I think our coverage area is somewhere around 40 schools. So it's obviously a couple hundred teams there for different sports and tons of different athletes. So it can be tough to kind of keep your finger on the pulse. But I think once you kind of do it, you kind of know, okay, this school has a strong track team. So we know we want to get something on them at some point. You just kind of get used to it over the years, and, eventually the names start getting pretty familiar. I think one of my biggest issues now with my writing is I've been, covering the same towns for so long now. I'm covering like, little brothers and little sisters of kids, and I'm writing the older brothers and sisters names by accident just because those names are so ingrained in my brain already. But yeah, it can be challenging, but I think if you just kind of you kind of get used to it after a little bit, and you kind of figure out, who are the teams to watch. And, now having been here for, pretty much covering the South Shore and the Brockton area for almost 10 years now, I kind of have a little bit more of a history to look at. So I kind of know, like, if a team that, is typically struggling in the sport, they're kind of having they're having a nice bounce back year, that's usually a pretty good story there. So, stuff like that, you kind of just from being around, you'll eventually kind of figure it out and get the lay of the land.
Awesome, awesome. And as we saw in 2020, the pandemic kind of shifted so much in so many fields. But for you specifically, what was the challenge in COVID, as we saw like a lot of high school sports not having any sports, um, trying to cover stories even with no sports? Was there a challenge in that aspect?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a huge challenge. There was a lot of adjustments that we had to make. I think something that made it a little bit easier is we were kind of transitioning the way we wanted our sports section to look before that, so it just kind of accelerated some of that change. Some of the change that we were kind of making is that, we wanted something that's always resonated with me, that someone told me, is that they want people who don't like sports to be able to enjoy it, to get away from just writing straight game stories and stuff like that and covering it, maybe the way that we used to back in the day. We try to focus more on feature stories and profiles, and, things that can kind of appeal to a broader interest. So we were a little bit more prepared when we didn't have the day-to-day game stories and stuff like that to rely on. So we went, very feature heavy, focus more on profiles and highlighting people. And, we did some more interesting stuff where we kind of look back at some of the best teams of the decade, just to get a constant flow. I don't know how much longer we could have gone on without sports, but, I'm pretty proud to say that, our staff was able to continually put out a quality sports section. Even, when people say there were no sports, we found sports to write about. And, I think we still put out a quality product that, kind of shows, what we're capable of even in tough times.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
did
and
you find yourself writing more, like, let's say, feature stories on schools or teams, just because there were no sports, or even analytical stories and statistics, just to kind of create different avenues, like you said, so that way someone who's not just only interested in sports could just still be interested on like more of a feature story about a coach that they've heard and seen maybe in throughout the newspapers, just reading the newspaper, and really didn't know that about that one coach.
Yeah, so that was definitely something. Sometimes you get into a flow where there's so much going on where you feel like you can't get to everything, or you can't write as much about something as you want. So I think during the pandemic, when everything kind of stopped, we were able to really kind of slow things down and really zoom in on, certain stories. Like, I remember, a bunch of kids were picked for a local high school football all-star team. So typically we might not even run a story on that, or if we did, we might just list their names. But in this case, we were able to, write a feature story on each one of those kids. And, we were able to turn something that would have been small, or something we might not have even done in the past, into, this really great series of a bunch of interesting and different, feature stories, kind of getting an in-depth look at these kids, kind of beyond the pads, and not just looking at, their stats, kind of looking at who they are as kids. And, that stuff like that is something that we definitely, whenever we saw the chance for a story to kind of become multiple and extrapolate a little bit more and zoom in, we definitely took that opportunity, because, there wasn't a lot of new stuff coming in. So we kind of had to get a little more creative with what kind of stuff we were focusing on.
Yeah, yeah, I can totally relate because I'm at Stono College. I'm the sports editor for our newspaper, and in the fall semester and even winter, there was no fall sports or even winter sports. So you kind of had to be creative of just creating different stories and asking athletes of certain things and creating different avenues to just keep those stories coming in. But kind of shifting a little bit more on the educational side of things, because on my podcast, I also like to help any aspiring sports journalists out there who are trying to jump into the field. But from your experience so far as a sports editor, how important is it to write those stories like we've been talking about, like feature stories, analytical stories, and just diversifying your portfolio when you try to go out into the field?
Yeah, I mean, just from my perspective, I think when, for us, we're covering such a niche audience to begin with, that, we're really, we're our market is kind of small when you think about what our readership is. If we're just going to write about, one high school football team's game, that doesn't have a ton of broader appeal outside of that town or that league, or, people who are just really big high school football fans or whatever sport it may be. So when you can find a way to highlight, a great student athlete who's doing something off the field, I think that's something that has a broader appeal. Plus, I think after once you've written 100 game stories, you kind of, whatever the number is, you kind of, everything kind of becomes formulaic a little bit. So to be able to kind of work on those other writing muscles where there's a lot more stress put on your ability to write and kind of describe things in a different way, where you have a little bit more freedom when you're writing a feature story versus a game story. I think those are big things. And interviews are obviously huge when you're writing writing an in-depth feature on somebody, whereas a game story, you can sometimes you can get away with really just highlighting the play-by-play of the game, but a feature story, that writing is, for me personally, a lot more fun to do. And it's also more challenging, and it's something that I think is more transferable to other areas of writing, because if you're not always going to be writing a sports story, even if you work for a sports section. So I think those are important muscles to always kind of keep working on, and continue to try and put yourself out of your comfort zone to write those kind of stories.
Yeah, definitely. And what advice would you give to aspiring sports journalists, maybe trying who are graduating right now in their senior year in college and looking for jobs, just try to jump into the field?
Just kind of looking at your Twitter today, I would tell people use you as a model. I mean, you're out there doing a ton of different stuff. You got some great guests on your podcast, not myself included. I don't think I fit in with some of those other people, but
Nah, you do. Come on.
I appreciate that, but you have to do the work to get better at it. That's one of the things that I learned when I was first starting is, I did a ton of the work in the classroom, but once I got out into the field, I was like, whoa, this is a lot different. I didn't feel like I was able to prepare for my job based on what I did in the classroom, where I feel like maybe other jobs that there might be an easier transition. So for me, the biggest piece of advice is get out there, write, read, do all that stuff as much as possible, interview people. This is a job where you can only get better at by doing it. So that's my best advice, is to write about Andrew Jamil and then what he's doing after college, and to cover the local college teams at your school. Go there in person, get to know the coach, build those relationships, because those are skills you will always use and you will always have to work on if you want to be in this industry.
Awesome. Yeah. I totally agree. Like you said, a bunch of the guests I've had on before have kind of emulated the same things you've said. And it's something I try to do either on my Twitter or social media or even in my writing here at school. Just to kick off the last question on kind of a little lighthearted note and a little optimism. As we know, in 2020 was a little crazy and sports was a little jumpy, and high school started to play some sports in the spring. But what are you looking forward to as things start to get a little bit back to normal, with sports starting to kind of shift to their normal seasons, and your kind of style of work for the Ledger and the Enterprise?
I think the biggest thing I've missed during this year is the MIA didn't allow state tournaments. They're going to allow them in the spring. So having the state tournaments back, those are awesome times. There's so many great stories that you can tell. It's definitely a grind. It's, for me, I know it's a lot of times where it's like 2-3 weeks straight work and covering 1 or 2 games a day there. So it's definitely a grind. But just the excitement when you go to the games, the heartbreak of the losing team and the jubilation of the winning team, and getting to cover those stories and being in those environments where the whole town kind of rallies around a team. I can remember last fall, in 2019, the Rockland High volleyball team was going on the best run in program history, and it felt like every game that they won in the playoffs, the town got more and more behind the team, and it always kind of becomes a bigger story, and it's always fun to be a part of that. And I think personally, you look at, I think something that's cool about writing local sports is, I think people won't be paying attention to my name, but I think the bylines of my stories will be in a lot of scrapbooks for a lot of years. So I think that's something that's really cool to kind of be a part of those memories. And just the state tournament is just such a great time. Especially, my favorite is in the winter, covering, basketball and hockey. I think, something about being in those smaller buildings where this packed to the gills and everybody's screaming and the atmosphere is intense, and everybody is living and dying with every bounce of the puck or the ball. So, just being a part of those is always so fun. And, obviously those are kind of times with our peak readership where everybody's a little more tuned in and focusing on what we're writing about and how we're covering it. So, those that's probably definitely what I've missed most this last year.
Nice, yeah, and that atmosphere of championship games, I can recall being in high school, going to, like you said, a basketball or hockey state championship, and just the environment, the atmosphere, everyone just so involved and cheering on for their teammates and classmates as well. So, but that wraps it up for episode 4. Thanks, Chris, for joining my show today. I really appreciate it. If you're really interested into this content, you can head over to my YouTube channel at Desmond Bernal, where you can find this video version, and make sure you just hit a like on that video and even subscribe to my channel. I'd really appreciate it. You can also hear the audio version of this on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And make sure you also can hit follow me, like Chris mentioned before, on Twitter at Desmond Bernal 14. You can even follow Chris and see all the coverage he does, like he said, in the Brockton and South Shore area at Chris McDaniel. That's capital M, lowercase c, capital DANIEL 88 on Twitter. Always producing such good content for the Brockton and South Shore area. Just keeping everyone highlighted on the sports going on over there. And like I said, thanks for joining me, Chris. I really appreciate it. And we'll see you guys in the next episode.
Thanks for having me on, Desmond.